When you think about the great rulers in history, the ones who are remembered, you usually picture the strong ones.
Yeah. The ones who seize the moment.
Exactly. The ones who deployed, absolute power to crush their enemies and save their nations.
But history, well, it truly honors a different kind of leader, doesn't it? The ones who, in that moment of greatest crisis, actually chose to restrain themselves.
It's such a powerful idea.
It is. They showed that real strength isn't about how much power you can grab. It's about how much accountability you willingly accept.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are jumping into a chapter of constitutional history that, frankly, is stunning. It took place during a moment of profound existential chaos.
It really did.
We're analyzing the period right after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, specifically during the crisis known as the Ridda, or Apostasy Wars.
And to really get the significance here, you have to understand the stakes. I mean, they were astronomical. When the Prophet passed away, the new Muslim state, it just fractured almost instantly.
This wasn't just some political disagreement.
Oh, no, this was a full-blown emergency. The state that was built in Medina was fighting for its very survival against simultaneous rebellions from within and major threats from the outside.
And it wasn't just in one place. The chaos was, it was everywhere.
Exactly. It was geographically spread out. It was multifaceted. You had some tribes that refused to pay the zakat, the mandatory tax, which was basically a challenge to the entire financial and political authority of the state.
And others went even further.
Much further. They renounced the faith entirely, and they started joining these rival prophetic claimants. This was the moment where, maximum unchecked state power seemed not just justifiable.
Seemed required. Absolutely necessary for survival.
And yet, and this is the paradox we're starting with, Abu Bakr As-Siddiq, the first caliph, he chose the complete opposite path. He chose authority with restraint.
Power with accountability.
And victory with humility. And just for our audience, when we refer to him, we'll use the honorific RA, which means Radiyallahu anhu.
Or may God be pleased with him.
Yes, just acknowledging his historical stature as a companion of the Prophet.
So our mission today is to analyze exactly how he pulled this off.
Yeah.
How did he find that balance? We're focusing on a series of specific decisions, cases 49 through 56, which detail what we're calling the constitutional limits on emergency powers.
He was essentially saying, the law is above me.
Even while fighting a war for existence.
And these 8 decisions, when you look at them together, they created this timeless framework for how a leader facing total war should constitutionalize their own power.
So let's lay out the roadmap for this deep dive. We're going to trace 8 central lessons from these cases.
Okay, so we'll start with number 1. Clear limits on powers. The state can't just act arbitrarily.
Right. Second, a commitment to a swift return to normal governance once the crisis is over.
Third is a big one, financial accountability, starting from the leader himself.
And fourth, guaranteeing due process, even for people accused of treason.
Then fifth, establishing civilian oversight over the military. All military actions.
Number 6. Mandatory public transparency. The government have to explain its decisions.
7th, appointing people based on merit. Merit-based appointments over any kind of political favoritism.
And finally, the ultimate safeguard, what you could call constitutional humility, which was demonstrated by the leader's own oath.
And this isn't just a list of, nice ideas.
No, it's an interlocking system. It's a system where emergency powers are explicitly designed to protect the Constitution.
Not serve as an excuse to tear it down.
Exactly. So let's unpack the details. Okay, let's start by unpacking the first set of boundaries. These are the external limits placed on what the state could actually do in a life or death situation.
And this is so important because the instinct in war is always to just grab whatever you can.
Grab resources, punish opponents, move fast.
Right. And Case 49 deals with exactly that. It's titled Emergency Powers with Clear Boundaries. The source material is very clear that Abu Bakr, R.A., refused to cross certain ethical and legal lines that had been set by the Prophet.
Even when crossing them would have given him a huge advantage, right?
Yeah.
Like a tactical or financial edge in the war.
A massive advantage. Think about it. You've got hostile tribes actively fighting you. The most logical thing in the world is to confiscate their land, seize their wealth, you fund your army, and you starve the opposition.
It seems like a no-brainer, militarily speaking. So why, practically, did he refuse to take that shortcut?
Because the entire legitimacy of the state rested on the rule of law. And in that context, the rule of law meant sticking to revelation and established precedent.
So what was the specific line he wouldn't cross?
The refusal to confiscate private property without a clear, established legal cause. Just because a tribe was fighting you didn't mean their assets were automatically forfeited. You dealt with them on the battlefield, but their property rights remained intact under the law.
So he's making a profound statement there about property rights. He's saying these rights are fundamental. They're not just privileges the state can suspend when things get tough.
Precisely. That's the core of it. If the government can just seize your assets based on suspicion or because you're associated with an enemy,
Which is a classic tool of authoritarian regimes in wartime.
it's page 1 of the playbook, and it teaches the people that the state is a predator, not a protector. By setting that external boundary before he acted, he was showing that the government itself was bound by law and ethics.
Let's try to ground this in a modern idea. This sounds a lot like constitutional protections against arbitrary seizure of property, right? Like eminent domain, which requires just cause and compensation.
It's the same principle, and his refusal back then established that wartime necessity doesn't just give you a blank check to suspend core rights.
And it prevents that mission creep we see so often.
Exactly that phrase. The risk of mission creep is huge. A seizure starts as a temporary wartime necessity, but then it slowly erodes property rights permanently.
It becomes the new normal.
Right, and by refusing to blur that line between protecting the state and what is essentially state robbery, Abu Bakr ensured that the foundational economic trust you need for a stable society, it stayed intact, even during a war.
So the lesson from Case 49 is really powerful.
It is. The constitutional limits on executive authority are paramount. The law has to define the state's reach, not the leader's whim.
It basically stops the war from becoming an excuse for theft. It keeps the conflict about defending principles, not just a land grab.
Absolutely, and he was setting a standard for every governor and every commander who came after him. You fight justly, or your victory means nothing. It's illegitimate.
Now that brings us to Case 50, which deals with another huge danger of emergency powers.
The fact that they never seem to go away.
Exactly. In our modern world, we see it all the time. A temporary surveillance program, special security measures put in place after a crisis, and then 10 years later, they're just a permanent part of the bureaucracy.
That phenomenon is precisely what Case 50 was designed to prevent. The source material really emphasizes the sheer speed of the shift back to normalcy.
So as soon as the threat receded,
Immediately. After key military victories, once the act of rebellion was truly quelled, Abu Bakr, RA, started reducing the emergency measures.
and these were tangible controls, things people felt day to day.
Oh, yes. We're talking about temporary restrictions on movement between regions, maybe limits on certain types of trade to stop resources from getting to the rebels.
And the example cited is that those controls on movement and trade were lifted swiftly.
Very swiftly. And that shows a conscious, deliberate choice by the executive to dismantle the extra powers the second the justification for them was gone. It's the polar opposite of what you called normalized exceptionalism.
I love that term, normalized exceptionalism. It's when the emergency measure becomes the new everyday reality. But for a leader who just risked everything to consolidate power, why would he willingly give up tools that make governing easier?
Because keeping those tools sends a long-term signal of distrust to the people. And it fundamentally changes the nature of the state from one based on freedom to one based on control. He was thinking about the long-term health of the Constitution.
So emergency powers need an expiration date baked into them.
They have to. What modern law calls a sunset clause. If they don't have that clear, enforceable end date, they metastasize, they grow and become permanent.
And a sunset clause is such a brilliant legal tool. The law itself contains the instruction to self-destruct once its purpose is done.
And his commitment wasn't just passive, like letting it expire. It required active dismantling. The burden of proof was on him, on the executive, to show that the state was healthy enough to go back to peacetime laws.
Rather than just keeping the emergency footing because it's convenient.
Exactly. The lesson is simple, but it's so often ignored today. Emergency powers expire when the emergency ends. The leader has to put the health of the law above the convenience of his own administration.
Okay, so that brings us to individual justice. We're now at Case 52, which is about due process in the middle of a mass rebellion.
And the political environment here was just toxic. Public feeling must have been demanding immediate, severe punishment for anyone even suspected of helping the rebels.
But the requirement for justice stayed absolute.
Yes. The principle here is that urgency does not override justice. To really get this, we have to clarify what due process meant in this context. It was rooted in Shariah, which acts as the binding rule of law.
And that requires a specific standard of proof, a procedure.
A very specific standard. So for anyone accused of rebellion, two things had to be present before any punishment could happen. First, you had to follow the established legal procedure of formal trial or hearing.
Okay.
And second, critically, you needed hard, verifiable evidence. The burden of proof was on the state, and it was extremely high. The leadership just wasn't willing to compromise the integrity of the judicial process for, perceived security or a quick political win.
The source material gives a specific example of this, right? A tribe accused of helping the rebels.
Yes. And the circumstantial evidence must have been pretty strong, enough to raise serious suspicion. But they were acquitted.
So what does that tell us about how the system worked?
It tells us two things. One, that the judiciary was independent enough to make that call. And two, that the standard of evidence was so high that suspicion and political pressure just weren't enough.
You needed more.
They needed testimonies, confirmed accounts, or actual physical proof linking specific people to specific acts of rebellion. The government was willing to accept the legal risk of letting a potentially guilty person go free.
Rather than commit the constitutional sin of punishing an innocent one.
Exactly. And that is a huge philosophical commitment. In modern counterterrorism law, we wrestle with this exact tension all the time. Detaining people based on suspicion versus the right to see the evidence and have a fair trial.
So why did Abu Bakr believe so strongly that upholding due process, even for traitors, was more important than getting every possible conviction?
Because the long-term stability of the state depended on the public's absolute faith that the system was impartial. If the state starts executing or jailing people based on vague suspicion during a crisis, that precedent poisons everything that comes after. The public learns that justice is arbitrary.
He was prioritizing long-term submission to the rule of law over short-term military security.
He was. So the lesson from Case 52 really sets a high bar for state conduct. These fundamental due process rights, the right to evidence, a fair trial, they are necessary even when you're under intense threat.
It's like asking if you abandon the rule of law to survive.
Right.
What exactly did you save?
Exactly. You've just replaced one form of tyranny with another, only this time it's flying your own flag.
So for part 2, we're shifting our focus inward. We're looking at the internal systems that were put in place to protect the integrity of the state itself.
And these are the two areas most vulnerable to rot during a crisis: money and appointments.
When checks and balances are weakened by the sheer urgency of war, the personal integrity of the leader becomes the de facto law.
That's it. And these cases define that ethical firewall.
So let's start with Case 51, Treasury Independence and Anti-Corruption Standards. It kicks off with a really powerful statement of personal restraint from Abu Bakr.
It does. He established the ethical premise that the leader is not the owner of the state, but the guardian of public wealth.
And that separation between his personal money and the state's resources was absolute.
And it was demonstrably public. He explicitly forbade himself and all his governors from using public funds for personal gain beyond a stipulated modest salary. This sets an ethical standard that just cascades down the entire government.
Let's talk about that salary for a second. This is the head of state fighting a war for its existence. A state that, technically had significant resources coming in from spoils of war. He could have been immensely wealthy.
He could have been. But the historical accounts show he insisted on a salary that was just enough for a basic standard of living. It put him on par with an average citizen or a mid-level official.
So it wasn't a compensation package meant to confer luxury or privilege.
Not at all. And it wasn't a passive thing. He had to actively go to the governing council and ask them to set this precedent.
But the even more profound example of this comes at the very end of his caliphate, which was quite short. Upon his death, what was the extraordinary measure he took?
He ordered the immediate return of all state assets that he had used during his time in office. And think about what that actually means.
It's not just money.
No. It included any public funds he had received, any personal items gifted to him that could be seen as state property, even the value of garments that he had worn out, any salary funds he hadn't yet spent, all of it went back to the Treasury.
What's the calculation behind that? It's more than just good bookkeeping. It feels like a deep moral statement about being a temporary custodian.
That's exactly what it is. It's all about custodianship. He was demonstrating in the most powerful way possible that his role as caliph was a fixed-term guardianship. It was not a license to build a family fortune or enrich himself.
He was performing a public retroactive audit on himself.
Yes. guaranteeing that his legacy, and by extension, the legitimacy of the office itself, was financially pure. He was basically saying, the office is poor, the man is mortal.
And the message that sends to every governor and official down the line is just unmistakable.
It's crystal clear. If the leader of the entire Muslim world is living by this meticulous standard of separation and self-denial, then there is zero excuse for any subordinate official to engage in even the smallest act of corruption.
And corruption is always a threat, but in a new, fragile state coming out of a war.
It's a fatal flaw. It's an existential threat. If the public starts to think that the war effort is just lining private pockets, their loyalty evaporates overnight.
So by making financial accountability a core constitutional requirement, he actually secured more long-term public legitimacy than any military victory could have.
Without a doubt. Case 51 proves that the guardian of public wealth must, by necessity, be the most financially accountable person in the entire state.
Okay, so shifting from money to manpower, let's look at Case 55, which is about the appointment of competent governors.
Another area under huge pressure during a crisis.
For sure. The instinct for a leader is to appoint your family, your tribal allies, people who you know will be unquestionably loyal. It's the easiest way to ensure compliance.
That's the path of political expediency. But Abu Bakr, R.A., prioritized meritocracy instead. The sources emphasized that officials were appointed based on proven competence, not their family name or their tribal allegiance.
And that must have carried significant political risk, ignoring those powerful tribal connections.
It did, but he elevated competence to the level of a constitutional requirement.
Why, though? In a civil war, wouldn't loyalty be the most important thing you need?
You need loyalty, of course. But incompetence during an emergency has devastating cascading costs. A poorly managed governor or a weak general doesn't just lose money or resources.
They lose lives, they lose provinces.
And they lose public confidence in a heartbeat. The state just cannot afford the luxury of tolerating mediocrity when its very existence is on the line.
So he needed people who could think clearly, act decisively, and maintain justice across these huge contested territories.
Exactly. And that kind of administrative efficiency is built on merit. But the source also highlights something else that's maybe even more important than the initial appointment.
And that is?
The necessity of immediate administrative correction. Weak or unjust officials were removed immediately.
Why so fast? Why not give them a chance to, adjust to the role?
Because a delayed response to injustice or incompetence implies that the state endorses it. If a governor is failing and the caliph does nothing, that failure undermines the caliph's own legitimacy in that entire region.
So immediate removal preserves public trust.
It preserves trust, and it sends a clear signal that the state demands not just loyalty, but high performance and absolute justice. It stops an administrative failure from turning into another political rebellion.
This really is a robust early civil service standard. It's a transparent system saying your tribe or your connections mean nothing if you can't do the job, especially when lives are on the line.
That's it. The principle of Case 55 is foundational. Competence is a constitutional requirement, especially when the state is fragile. You simply cannot survive an existential crisis by filling critical roles with political favors.
Okay, so we've saved what might be the most profound limits for last. This section really defines the character of this new state.
It does. It establishes the ultimate checks on the military, it ensures open government, and it even places conditions on the leader's own authority.
These decisions really get at the tension between what's needed for military victory right now versus the long-term constitutional structure you're trying to build.
They confirm that the system they were fighting for was a state based on the rule of law, not a military dictatorship.
Which brings us to Case 53, civilian oversight over military command. This feels like a genuine paradox. You're in a war where your military commanders are, quite literally, your only hope of survival. It seems so counterintuitive to put such strict civilian checks on them when military success is everything. How did Abu Bakr even begin to balance that?
This is where the rubber meets the road for the principle of civilian supremacy. The decision was unambiguous. Military commanders remain strictly subordinate to the civilian leadership back in Medina.
The army defends the Constitution.
But it does not define the law, or the ethics, or the political direction of the state.
So what does that look like in practice during a hot war? It can't mean he was on a map in Medina micromanaging troop movements.
No, not at all. It meant retaining the moral and the legal veto. The sources note that Abu Bakr, R.A., was willing to countermand battlefield decisions when they conflicted with moral or legal principles.
So this wasn't about tactics, it was about conduct.
Precisely. Things like the treatment of prisoners, whether you adhere to treaties prohibiting unnecessary destruction, the rules of war, essentially.
So let me get this straight. A commander in the field makes a decision based on tactical expediency, say, to execute prisoners to save on food and guards, or seize civilian goods, and the caliph, hundreds of miles away, could override that decision based purely on principle.
That's exactly what it meant, and it required immense moral fortitude. By overriding a field commander, you're risking morale. You're risking immediate tactical success.
But by doing it.
By doing it, he anchors the state to a higher moral purpose. He establishes that following the law and acting ethically is a strategic imperative that outweighs any short-term tactical gain. The commander serves the state and its principles, not the other way around.
That sets the stakes for the military incredibly high. It makes sure they understand they are an instrument of the law, not its master.
And that is the timeless lesson of Case 53. Armies defend constitutions, they do not define them. This commitment is what prevents a state from sliding into military rule, even when the military is the most powerful institution it has.
Okay, next up, Case 54. Public accountability and transparent decisions. This takes the whole idea of accountability out of the back rooms and puts it right into the public square.
The mechanism here is just extraordinary, especially for a government at war. The caliph held open gatherings where any citizen could question war decisions. Tactical, moral, financial, anything. Accountability was institutionalized not as some favor granted by the leader, but as a constitutional right of the people being governed.
Just imagine the time that must have taken during the most critical period of the state's existence. He had to stop, publicly justify military actions, and invite people to scrutinize them. What was the purpose of subjecting himself to that?
Well, there were a few critical purposes. First, it builds public trust. When the leader has to justify his decisions, people understand why a certain tribe was attacked or how war funds were being spent. They feel invested. They're less likely to rebel themselves.
And
Second, transparency is the ultimate deterrent against corruption and the abuse of power.
Right. If you're a governor or a commander and you know that your actions are going to be scrutinized by the caliph and then publicly questioned by some random citizen in Medina,
you are far less likely to cut corners or commit abuses. The fear of public exposure becomes a more effective check than any internal audit ever could be.
And it also creates a feedback loop, doesn't it? It ensures the government's policies aren't completely detached from what ordinary people are actually experiencing during the war.
Absolutely. This is the historical precursor to things like parliamentary oversight and modern public hearings. It shows that open government isn't some luxury for peaceful, modern societies. It's a necessary, robust tool for legitimate power, even when the state is in crisis.
So the lesson of Case 54 is crystal clear.
Accountability is a constitutional right, and transparency is the oxygen that legitimacy breathes, especially during an emergency.
And now we've arrived at the climax of our deep dive. Case 56, the most powerful expression of what you called constitutional humility, self-restraint in leadership. This decision isn't about limiting your subordinates, it's about the man at the top limiting himself.
And this decision is defined by his famous inaugural quote, a statement that acts as a perpetual mandate for the leader's own obedience to an objective rule of law. It fundamentally shifts the power dynamic away from an absolute monarch to a conditional servant leader.
Okay, let's break down that quote because every single word carries so much weight. Correct me if I err. Obey me only as long as I obey Allah and his messenger.
Let's start with that first part. Correct me if I err. I mean, that is just monumental. He is granting the people being governed the right and maybe even the responsibility to dissent and to monitor him.
He's not asking for praise or flattery. He's institutionalizing citizen oversight of the executive.
He is. It shifts the citizen from being a passive subject to being an active constitutional partner. And it also means he's explicitly rejecting the idea that he's infallible. He's admitting his judgment is human and therefore it requires checks.
Precisely. Now, what about the second clause, which is even more powerful? Obey me only as long as I obey Allah and his messenger.
This is what makes his power entirely conditional. His authority is explicitly tied to his adherence to a higher objective law. If he deviates from the Shariah, that objective legal and ethical framework, then the public's obligation to obey him simply evaporates.
This is the complete opposite of ideas like the divine right of kings, where the monarch is God's representative on earth and is therefore beyond challenge. Abu Bakr is essentially saying, the law is my sovereign, and I am accountable to the law.
And that conditional mandate is the ultimate constitutional safeguard. If a leader accepts that principle, they can't become a dictator, because the very source of their authority, the consent of the governed, rooted in the rule of law, depends on their own moral and legal performance.
It gives a nonviolent constitutional path for removing a leader who oversteps.
Yes. It makes the oath of office not some one-time ceremony, but a continuous contract that is renewed every single day by the leader's own conduct.
Constitutional humility truly is the highest form of leadership.
It embodies the rule of law by making the ruler subject to it, not the author of it. These decisions ensured the first Islamic state was founded not on absolute power, but on conditional, accountable executive power.
So we have covered some extraordinary ground today. We've analyzed how Abu Bakr, RA, in the middle of the most violent emergency imaginable, the Shariah Wars, he didn't just win the war, he made sure the Constitution survived the emergency stronger than it was before.
These 8 cases really did establish a comprehensive interlocking system for emergency governance. It's worth just quickly synthesizing the 8 pillars we identified from cases 49 through 56. This is the blueprint for principled governance in a crisis.
Okay, Pillar 1. Setting clear pre-existing limits on emergency powers, like in case 49, where he refused to arbitrarily confiscate property.
Pillar 2. Guaranteeing a swift return to normal governance with things like sunset clauses, which we saw in case 50.
Pillar 3. Enforcing strict financial accountability, making the leader the guardian of public wealth, not its owner. That was case 51, with the return of assets after his death.
Pillar 4. Upholding due process during wartime, demanding fair trials and hard evidence, even for accused traitors. That was case 52.
Pillar 5. Maintaining civilian oversight over military command, making sure the moral and legal veto always rested with the civilian leadership, which was case 53.
Pillar 6. Demanding public transparency in state actions, making accountability a citizen's right through those open gatherings for scrutiny. Case 54.
Pillar 7. Prioritizing merit-based appointments over politics or family because competence is a constitutional requirement. That's case 55.
And finally, Pillar 8. Leadership defined by humility and conditional authority, all encapsulated in that powerful oath of office from case 56.
The overarching conclusion here is it's revolutionary. Crisis does not justify dictatorship. In fact, it's the very moment when a leader's ability to uphold justice and the Constitution is most critically tested.
Right, and this framework achieved a balance that modern states, with all their sophisticated legal systems, still struggle with desperately.
It really makes you question the things we accept as normal today. I mean, do we see leaders swiftly dismantling emergency surveillance or executive orders the minute a threat subsides?
Rarely. The lesson from Abu Bakr, RA, is that true strength is found in relinquishing power when it's no longer strictly necessary.
It really highlights that central tension that defines any legitimate government. Strength without restraint just becomes tyranny.
And restraint without strength becomes weakness. He found that crucial equilibrium. He was fighting not just to survive militarily, but for the principle that the state itself must be just.
The final summary of these 8 cases is really just that simple idea.
It is power disciplined by justice. It's a timeless idea that the most effective way to guarantee stability isn't through absolute force, but through absolute adherence to the rule of law.
And that really is the ultimate takeaway line from this deep dive. True leadership is power disciplined by justice, established during one of the most chaotic times in early Islamic history.
And as you reflect on this timeless framework, consider this one final provocative thought. Think about that principle of civilian oversight we discussed in case 53. If your highest military authority is permanently subordinate to the moral and legal authority of a civilian leader, what does that fundamentally tell you about the DNA of that state?
A powerful point of reflection for today. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the constitutional limits of emergency powers. We look forward to having you next time.